So that means this was the context in which the independent India enacted a new law or another law to complement the Indian Forest Act 1927, which was called Forest Conservation Act 1920. The purpose was to mitigate or control the rampant deforestation going on in the aftermath of 1927 Act. So the Forest Conservation Act 1980 is quite clear about its two objectives. The first one is to put more strict restriction on the use of forest land for non-forest purposes. And the second objective is to control of de-reservation of forests that have been reserved under the Indian Forest Act. Because the context of the second point needs to be understood. For example, the reason why the Indian Conservation Act 1980 focuses on control of de-reservation of forests, because many states in the aftermath of 1927, it was easy for the state to de-reserve forests if they needed it for various other purposes. So the Forest Conservation Act sought to control that activity from the part of the state governments. The major features of this Forest Conservation Act 1980 are the regulatory power. It witnessed a major shift of regulatory power from the state governments to the central government. That means it introduced the mandatory prior approval from the central government for use of forest for non-forest purposes. For example, this actually presumed that the power exercised by the state government in the regime of 1927 Act, they used it for using forest for several other purposes. It was in their discretion what kind of use can be put for foresters. So this this 1980 statute, it introduced this major power, or it shifted major power from the state government to the central government, so that for all activities to use forest for non-forest purposes required mandatory prior approval from the central government. So for two other purposes which also required prior approval from the central government are to de-reserve forest and also to lease out forest to private agencies. That means when we look at these provisions all together, the idea was to concentrate more regulatory powers on the central government, and so that major powers exercised by the state governments during the 1927 Act was taken away. Again, this presumption that the central government is more serious about protection of forests, this is questionable, and there is no reason why state governments are not serious and why the central governments are expected to be more serious, which is not quite clear. Maybe because different state governments were following different policies and different approaches. So the Indian Forest Act 1980 tried to consolidate the ecological part of protecting forests in India. And we also need to spend 1 minute on this concept of non-forest purposes. This is the key part of Indian Forest Act 1980, which mandates prior approval from the central government to use forest for non-forest purpose. The term non-forest purpose has been defined in the 1980 Act as, let me read it, breaking up or clearing of any forest land or portion thereof for the cultivation of tea, coffee, spices, rubber, palms, oil bearing plants, horticulture crops or medicinal plants. So the idea is, the concept is not to clear forest for cultivation purposes or for other economic purposes. And in this case, an exception is breaking up of trees for the purpose of reforestation does not come under the definition of non-forest purposes. That means the state government can introduce or take initiatives for reforestation purposes without the mandatory prior approval from the central government. Another major feature of the Indian Forest Act 1980 is the Forest Advisory Committee at the central level, because as I have already mentioned, this one of the key features of the Indian Forest Act is this prior approval, the procedure of prior approval. And in this case, this Forest Advisory Committee is the major institutional mechanism that facilitates the central government to grant or not to grant various requests or proposals for use of forest for non-forest purposes. In this case, the Forest Advisory Committee constituted at the central level, they advises the government on grant of approval, and they can also specify various conditions and restrictions in such permission for diversion. That means, this is a mechanism, this is the way that the Forest Conservation Act seeks to regulate the diversion of forest for non-forest purposes. Now the major third part of this module is the forest conservation and what kind of role the Indian judiciary has played in terms of shaping forest laws in India. To summarize this, I mean the major roles, I mean judiciary has been playing critical significant roles in terms of shaping or widening the scope of forest laws or shaping new rules. For example, let us take the example of how the judiciary has widened the scope of Indian forest laws. For example, first they widened the meaning of forest, and one important case in this context is the Godavarman case, where the Supreme Court defined forest as all land recorded as forest come under the purview of Act. And there is a specific context in which the Indian Supreme Court has widened this scope, because as per the earlier definition, various state governments were applying a very limited definition of forest to include only reserved forest under the definition of forest. The Supreme Court expanded the scope of this definition and included all forest in its dictionary sense, as well as all forest as notified in the government documents as forest under the Forest Conservation Act. The implication of this judgment is that now the state government's power is limited in terms of all forests, because the state government has to seek prior approval from the central government if they want to use all these forests for any non-forest purposes. And the Indian judiciary has also played significant roles in terms of regulation of various activities in the forest, and it could be in the case of permitting various activities, or it could be the case of prohibition of several activities. For example, let us take this Godavarman case again, where the court prohibited sawmills near forest, and they introduced this rule of 100 km, and all sawmills should be away from, beyond 100 km from the forest. That means all sawmills which are within the limit of 100 km from the forest, the state governments were asked to remove such sawmills. So that means the government, the Supreme Court was actually interpreting the forest law and introducing new regulatory tools or new rules under the scope of Indian Forest Act. And similarly, they also ordered for a complete ban on felling of trees in the tropical evergreen forest in Arunachal Pradesh, again in the Godavarman case. So this is to be noted that Godavarman case is an extremely important case in the context of forest laws in India. For example, the Supreme Court has taken this case as a continuing mandamus, and Supreme Court, under this case, Supreme Court continues to monitor various rules and regulations and implementation of forest laws in India. And it has widened the scope of this case, and now and introduced a number of rules, and this prohibition of sawmills or complete ban on felling of trees in the forest in Arunachal Pradesh. These are just some of the examples where the Supreme Court has introduced several rules under as part of this Godavarman case. Another important thing in this context of permission and prohibition is whether housing colonies can be allowed or permitted in the forest. But in this case, in the Goa Foundation case 1999, the Bombay High Court said, I quote, housing project after conversion of the natural reserved zones would be an eyesore in the green belt. The implication is that the court disapproved this idea of housing colonies, setting up of housing colonies in the forest, and they concluded that this amounts to an unacceptable use of Indian forest. And also they did not permit this setting up of housing colony in the interest of protection of forest.